welcome to Health Issues. I'm your host, Chris Sylvain, and believe me, we are thoroughly excited about today. Couldn't be happier. We have a great guest on today, and we have Dr. George Amedee. He is a professor of political science at Southern University in New Orleans. Welcome, Dr. Amedee. How are you today?
Welcome. Glad to be here.
Hey, no, excited to have you. And obviously, we're here talking about the current things that are in the news today, politically, dealing with Representative Steve Scalise and the issue of him speaking to this white nationalist or white heritage group. The subject of race comes up, and the Ku Klux Klan and so forth, and you know, just as we're starting, and we'll start right there. The African in America, African American, was looked at as 3/5 of a man, but you're saying that's not the whole picture.
No, I always say that's a misnomer, because the 3/5 compromise, as it was called, and this was one of the central areas of controversy over the rewriting of the Constitution, because we were under the Articles of Confederation, and when the Articles of Confederation fell, there was a rewriting of the Constitution, and so the idea of the compromise was to determine that there would be two houses of Congress, a Senate and a House, one based on equal representation, two people from each state, and the other based on population. And so there was a controversy between free states and slave states. Obviously, if the free states could count their slaves in the population, it would increase their representation in the House. So the free states supported counting slaves in the population, and the slave states supported it, and the free states opposed it. The compromise, and there was a number of other compromises related to that whole piece. That was just only one compromise in the 3/5 compromise, was that if for every 5 slaves, 3 would be counted for the purposes of representation. With the point I was making, that it accorded slaves 0 rights and privileges, none whatsoever. So to even say that we were counted as 3/5 of man would have been much better off than what the reality was, because the reality was we were still viewed the same way as subhuman. But for the purposes of the advantage to the southern states or the slave states, we were counted for the purposes of representation. The other elements of the 3/5 compromise was the return slave policy, a ban on the importation of slavery after 1808, and what the free states actually got was the right to regulate interstate commerce by a simple majority. So it was an economic piece that they got as part of the compromise to give the slave states additional counting of blacks, 3/5 for every 5, 3. So those numbers. Even the discussion on 1/16. Blood cannot be. You can't go into. If I hold up blood from a white person and from a black, you can't differentiate what 16th part. No, the way they did that, you go back generations. So your mother's mother, your great. So you spread out 16 generations if you keep going back. Your parents, your grandparents are 4, your great-grandparents are 8, your great-great-grandparents are 16. If one of those 16
from great-great-grandparents,
just one of those 16, you could be whiter than the driven snow. In appearance, and that's why we have some black people look whiter than supposedly white folk, because if one of those great-great-grandparents was black, that's the one drop.
So
that's how you.
So that was a reality. That's just not a joke. That was codified into law.
What I'm saying, it was it was once again one of those calculations.
Okay.
There's no reality in blood being 1/16 black.
Right.
You know, that's foolishness.
Okay.
You know,
so that was written in some law somewhere.
Yeah, that's the way they did it. That's the way they determined 1/16. They traced back your ancestry.
To do the 3/5, they had to do the 1/16.
No, the 3/5 is a different thing.
That's different.
That's a different thing.
Okay.
But I'm talking about the slaves and how they were counted. But you had a discussion previously with your previous about the one drop or 1/16, and I was explaining that you know, just like you know, there was no such thing as 3/5 thing, but with 1/16 only meant that they could go back to your ancestry, and that if one of the great grandparents were black, then you were said to be black.
No doubt about it. Now let me ask you this about this 3/5 compromise. When did this occur?
This happened at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia.
17 something. This is 200 and some odd years
after
ago.
the war, they convened. Won the war and convened a constitutional convention in Philadelphia, and those were the areas that came up in terms of was an area of controversy in terms of in terms of rewriting the Constitution, because once again the Articles of Confederation had failed, and there was because the Confederation did not succeed because the nation was weak under the Confederation, and there was almost a second revolution that came about as a part of Shays' Rebellion. So, Shays' Rebellion was the catalyst. Said, look, we need to relook at this Constitution. Because militarily, economically, financially, every which way, the Confederation was weak. The national government had no power. States were almost behaving as individual countries. So that's where the idea. So the convention convened, and the 3/5 compromise was compromise that came out of the controversy over how free enslaved states would treat or determine representation in the House. That's simply.
So our beloved Constitution had us listed as 3/5.
Yes.
That great document.
That great document
had big holes in it.
Big holes, yeah.
So walk us through. I mean, we started at 3/5, which we're really, like you say,
zero rights and privileges.
We're zero.
In fact,
1/5 would have been good.
Zero rights and privileges in the fact that for the vast majority of that period, the overwhelming majority of black folk were slaves. And which meant that we could be treated any kind of way, raped, worked to death, the only right you had if someone affected, of course we know that the Dred Scott case, which said Dred Scott was escaped from his master, so-called master, and brought the case that he was in free territory because Congress had passed a law banning slavery in the territory. Because of the abolitionist movement, and there were voices against it. So banning slavery in the territory. So Dred Scott's case, I'm in free territory, I should be free. And of course, that Supreme Court ruled that Dred Scott, first and foremost, could not sue because that's the zero rights and privileges. He was chattel property. Your desk can't sue you, your dog can't sue you. Although nowadays dogs have rights and privileges, and that Congress could not make laws regulating slavery in the territories, and that eventually led to the Civil War. Historians always say, well, what was the cause of the Civil War? People say slavery. And that's not exactly correct. It's actually the expansion of slavery to the West, because most of the country conceded that slavery should exist where it already existed, but many felt as though for moral reasons and also because it was an inefficient economic production means, that it should be eliminated. And so the Civil War ensued over the expansion. Every territory that came into play, first Missouri, you had the Missouri Compromise. Folk from the South would move into the south of the state. Folk from the North would move to the north. Then they would fight over when it would become a state, whether it be a slave state or a free state. Then it was Kansas. We talk about bleeding Kansas. Kansas did bleed. The people in the South moved to the south of the state. The people in the North moved to the north. And so you have that pattern with every state. And so eventually it could not be settled. Lincoln, South Carolina declared, it was getting out of the Union. And of course, Lincoln would not have it. The war ensued. And that was where many, you had Afro-American politics before that, but most of it basically in terms of abolition, Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and folk involved in abolition movement. No real significant participation in politics by African Americans prior to the end of the Civil War and the advent of Reconstruction.
I'm gonna put a pin right there. I just want to. I want you to keep going because this is awesome information. Now, put a pin right there. Before we go into Reconstruction, help me understand the abolitionist movement.
Okay, the abolitionist. Now, the history of the United States is a history in which the people who came to this country came for one of three reasons: either for economic freedom or religious freedom or political freedom. Some of the groups who came to this country were individuals, and I'm talking about whites, Quakers, who abhorred any notion of slavery. That whole thing. And even going back on the first ship that came on the Mayflower, there were blacks on there. Blacks have always been involved with their own resistance, even as far back as we can go. Everyone first coming in as indentured servants, white and black, and eventually, Indians and whites no longer were indentured servants. It became economically productive for the capitalist system to use physically fit, well-skilled Africans for free labor. And so, but there's always been that resistance. Also, among blacks, among whites, particular Quakers and those with that history. But also we have to look at the African Methodist Episcopal Church and their involvement in the abolitionist movement. So, Richard Allen, the founder of the AME Church, was part of the Methodist Church, and you know the story that they went to pray in Philadelphia and was asked to be relegated upstairs. They refused. He left and started the African Methodist Episcopal Church. So the Underground Railroad, and also Canadians, were part of that network. So the abolitionist movement, we hear a lot about Harriet Tubman, but it was an extensive network. I went to a Pan-Africanist country, and found out that that network extended all the way up to Canada, and some of the churches, were involved in that as well. I even found out that the area where those churches were, that's where Paul Martin had come from, in Canada. So, okay. So the abolitionist movement was a very important movement, and which had people who had escaped from slavery, folk that were free people of color, like Richard Allen, who had a distaste for the treatment, and folk like Harriet Tubman. So the abolitionists fundamentally disagreed with slavery on moral grounds. It wasn't about whether or not slavery was an inferior economic production mechanism. It was about it was wrong. It was not biblical. It was, not human. And so, the abolitionism. Now you had, once again, other people who were anti-slavery, those who didn't want the free soilers, they wanted the territory to be free, but many of them said, well, wherever it already is, it could be. Okay. But, and then those who represented, the Republicans who represented the Northeast business interests, many of them, they were looking at the manifest destiny of trying to get the railroads from one end of the country and trying to get them. And so this slavery thing they saw was really not good, even though a lot of the money that came from launching the economics of this country, you had Northerners invest in slavery in the South. You still had that. So the abolitionist movement was effective in that sense, but it was also a coalition of other forces as well. Other reasons why there needed to be an end to slavery. One thing, I think, the fact that Lincoln was strong about keeping the Union together, and the last straw was, seceding from the Union, and so that was one of the reasons. So the abolition movement was very important. But I say the real politics began with Black Reconstruction, because in every Southern, first and foremost, you had military occupation. Okay. The federal troops were here. Now, even though you had federal troops here, okay, in some cases, you still had Klan and other whites still extracting violence and terror. It wasn't like, there was almost like after the Civil War, it was like a third war going on, but it was like skirmishes. There was never a period in time where the Southern states, maybe in mouths, accepted a defeat of the war, but they never really did. In every Southern state, practically, you had guerrillas and folk still pressing and still, but I say Reconstruction because that is we consider the glory period, one of the highlights of Black folk in terms of political power, electing Blacks to various political office, and franchising Blacks, period. Something that, in most of the time we were not enfranchised, did not have the right to vote. While at the same time, the former Confederates were disenfranchised. So they were disenfranchised because they would not pledge. They still pledged the loyalty to the Confederacy, even though Lee might have surrendered, but most of the Southerners didn't surrender. Really? You follow me? All of them didn't sign the paper. So Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox, and but everyone else did not. And so but you still have some, of course, we had 2 governors in Louisiana, Oscar Dunn and Pinchback. We had a lot going on. Even while Reconstruction was going on, and this is around the between 65 and 66, Nathan Bedford Forrest, a former general in the Confederacy, was part of a group that became the first imperial wizard in Ku Klux Klan. It was originated in Pulaski, Tennessee.
During Reconstruction?
During the Reconstruction period. And that because it almost appears as though, to me, that the frustration with the defeat of the South was then turned towards African Americans. You see night riders going, just coming in, and mainly in such a way as to not uncover themselves, a secret society, hooding themselves, taking oaths, and still wreaking havoc. Even in terms of, to the extent that so much was going on, and I was reading the other day correspondence from African Americans in Kentucky, where they were just talking about what was going on with the Ku Klux Klan in Kentucky, and it was about 2 or 3 pages of just, this one got lynched, this one had his store burned, this one was ran out of town, and just lynching, over and over and over again. And so they were appealing for some type of assistance with that. And this was, even here within the Louisiana, we don't talk about the massacre at the Mechanic Institute, here where some liberal whites and blacks were looking at the possibility of getting the vote going, and that they were, it describes mobs and mobs of whites charging into this building and going up and just killing, and so and that was under the auspices of the Ku Klux Klan. Congress did an investigation around that time, and there was and I read what was called a minority report of that committee that looked at the Ku Klux Klan. The minority report was the report written by the Southern congresspersons. They did a minority report, and in that minority report, they portrayed lies about Reconstruction. The lies were that, first and foremost, the impression was that about those black elected officials, how ignorant they were, how they wanted to just they were violent, that they were wanting to perpetrate certain things on white women and on white community, and most of it was just lies. They portrayed these black leaders in such a way, and that's informative because that's the same type of rhetoric that was used after the troops left to continue this reign of terror.
Question about the reign of terror, not to interrupt you. We got a couple of more minutes. ISIS is a terrorist organization.
Correct.
Al-Qaeda is a terrorist organization.
Correct.
The Ku Klux Klan is a terrorist
organization, no doubt about it. And I would say could not have existed without the sanction from elected officials. State-sanctioned terrorism, the local sheriff. And we see that all the way through to the 1960s and 70s, you know.
So it stopped in the 70s?
Oh, no, well, no. I mean, it didn't stop in the 70s. But you see, that was what the various movements, the King movement was about, you know. Actually, the period after Plessy versus Ferguson, the Klan sort of receded because at the turn of the century, all of the lynching and everything else kind of put everything in place in the South the way they wanted it. So it really was the reactions to the 54 Brown case and Martin Luther King that the Klan had a resurgence. But there was a resurgence, one more thing, of the Klan at the turn of the 20th century. But that one was a little different because it was focused on Jews and also focused on Catholics as well. So that one was the next revival was at the turn of the 20th century.
All right, and as we close out a few more seconds, do we see a resurgence now, or is it just blended in, and is it any difference between the old Klan, and is it the same suit,
we see a resurgence of nationalist white supremacists. The Klan is one element of many groups, Aryans, skinheads, you know, world order people. But if you, in terms of the sheer numbers over the last 20 or 30 years, they've more than tripled. So the number of hate groups have grown. I don't know if you're aware, but in Denver, the NAACP office was blown up recently.
Yeah, I saw that in the news.
So the number of hate groups have increased.
If they're illegal, if ISIS is illegal, why isn't the Klan illegal?
Well, that's interesting because...
We're going to shut it down right here. Chris Sylvain, Health Issues. Thanks so much, Dr. Amedee. Fight as hard as you can. Let's love one another, but truth and righteousness must prevail. It's called justice. Thank you so much.